January 30th, 1944, Anzio beachhead, Italy. The ground shuddered as if the earth itself had inhaled sharply in fear, and Headman Vera Hoffman felt that tremor run through his bones before he even lifted his eyes from the periscope. When he did, what he saw almost made him forget to breathe. Bunker Louisa, a fortress of 4 feet of reinforced concrete that had survived months of punishment, was simply gone. Not cracked, not burning, gone, erased as if sketched in pencil and wiped away with a careless hand. Moments before, 32 men of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had been inside, secure in what German engineering standards promised could withstand the heaviest 210mm shells. Now, where they had trusted steel and concrete, there was only a jagged crater coughing dust into the afternoon sky. Hoffman's pencil shook as he wrote the only explanation possible: the Americans had unleashed a weapon no one on the German side believed existed. Firing from beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond any known threat, the M1 240mm Howitzer had made its combat debut, and its opening statement was annihilation. This incredible gun had its origins in a 1940 U.S. Army study that quietly admitted a dangerous truth: America's existing artillery, 155mm long toms, 8-inch guns, everything in the arsenal, could not reliably destroy the new generation of European bunkers. To defeat modern fortifications, the Army needed something unprecedented: a mobile weapon capable of hurling a 360-pound shell more than 14 miles with enough force and accuracy to crack 6 feet of reinforced concrete. American engineers were effectively told, build the impossible, and make it road mobile. Instead of the giant railway guns loved by Germany, America wanted a monster that could travel by truck, move across muddy roads, and be dug in wherever needed. Against all expectations, Waterflyed Arsenal delivered. The M1 240mm Howitzer weighed over 64,000 pounds in firing position, the barrel alone a 23,000-pound, 35-foot steel titan that required a 6-wheeled wagon and a dedicated crane to move. Setup demanded up to 8 hours of digging recoil pits, assembling components, and leveling the ground. A full crew of 14 men worked in precise choreography to load and fire a single round every 3 minutes, each shot sounding like a thunderclap slamming directly against the chest. It was powerful, yes, but more critically, it was accurate, made lethal by the American Fire Direction Center system that combined forward observers, radios, slide rule calculations, and meteorological corrections. When everything aligned, one gun could erase one bunker with surgical precision. And at Anzio, the Germans learned that precision kills morale faster than explosions. When the 697th Field Artillery Battalion arrived at the beachhead with the first 6 M1 howitzers ever sent into combat, German defenses seemed unbreakable. The hills overlooking the Allied position were a fortress network, interlocking concrete bunkers commanding every road, field, and approach. German engineers had shaped the terrain into a killing zone, confident their fortified lines would hold. At 14:30 on January 30th, the Americans fired their first combat round. That single shell flew more than 23,000 yards before smashing into a German observation post on the Alban Hills, and like Bunker Louisa, the position simply ceased to exist. Major Herman E. Smith, commanding the 697th, noted that captured German prisoners described the shells as earthquakes in metal jackets. They reported the ground shaking hundreds of meters around every impact, the shockwave collapsing lungs, bursting eardrums, and pulverizing concrete into clouds of white dust. Many German soldiers flatly refused to enter bunkers again, insisting that these underground shelters had become death chambers. The numbers were as chilling as the testimonies: 2,847 rounds fired at Anzio, 67 bunkers targeted, 61 completely destroyed, an average of fewer than 5 shots per bunker. For a weapon of this size, that ratio bordered on the miraculous. And the secret lay in its ammunition. The M17 concrete-piercing round, weighing 360 pounds, carried a hardened steel nose and a delayed fuse explosive charge. When fired at nearly 2,300 feet per second, it delivered more than 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy to an impact surface smaller than a dinner plate. The shell punched through concrete like a giant steel drill, boring 3 to 6 feet before its fuse ignited. The internal blast did not merely break walls, it shattered the entire structure from within through a wave phenomenon engineers called sympathetic fracturing, where shockwaves bounce between steel rebars and concrete layers, ripping bunkers apart from the inside like bursting a watermelon with dynamite. Even a near miss could collapse a bunker. The M114 high-explosive shell, with 49 pounds of TNT enhanced by aluminum powder for a 40% stronger blast, could carve a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. To men trapped inside concrete chambers, the effect was beyond terrifying. German diaries captured after the liberation of Rome tell of soldiers abandoning fortifications, officers begging their troops to return underground, and entire units refusing orders because they had seen too many comrades entombed alive. One line from the 715th Infantry Division said it plainly: losses from a single 240mm shell exceeded those from a whole day of conventional bombardment. This was not just firepower, it was psychological warfare. American observers miles away could watch a specific bunker, call out its coordinates, and minutes later simply erase it. Walls didn't matter. Steel didn't matter. Training didn't matter. Everything Germany believed about defensive warfare evaporated in clouds of concrete dust, and as Hoffmann observed the first crater where Bunker Luisa had once stood, he realized what thousands of German soldiers would soon learn across Italy and France: a new age of warfare had begun, and in it, no bunker was safe. The revelation unleashed at Anzio did not fade, it spread like a shockwave across the entire Italian front, reaching its apocalyptic crescendo at Monte Cassino, where German paratroopers of the elite Fallschirmjäger had turned ancient stone and modern concrete into a layered fortress that had resisted months of Allied assaults, carpet bombings, and every artillery piece short of naval guns. By May 1944, the Gustav Line seemed immovable, an iron hinge locking the Allies out of Rome, and every attempt to pry it open had ended in blood and frustration. But when the 240mm Howitzers of the 240th Field Artillery Battalion arrived during Operation Diadem, everything changed, not with speed, but with certainty. Positioned near Mignano, their guns elevated to near vertical angles, the massive howitzers lofted 360-pound shells so high that forward observers reported losing them into the clouds before watching them plunge almost straight down upon bunkers carved into the mountainside. British Major General Francis Tucker, whose troops had been shredded in earlier attempts, watched in awe as each American round struck like a divine hammer, obliterating positions that had previously required entire brigades to assault. Each hit erased a strong point, he wrote, and the German paratroopers knew it too. Many abandoned their fortifications after the first near miss, convinced that the next round would be their coffin. For 72 hours straight, the American super-heavy guns fired without pause, 1,847 rounds hurled at the Gustav Line's strongest positions, and when the smoke finally drifted away, post-battle analysis revealed a staggering truth: of 43 major bunkers targeted, 39 had been completely annihilated, and the remaining 4 were abandoned by their crews who had fled long before the shells reached them. The Germans began to understand that these weapons could not be endured, only avoided. But avoiding them was impossible. The brilliance of the American system wasn't just the gun, it was the entire mathematical orchestra behind it. Forward observers with SCR 610 radios watched the slopes through telescopes, called in coordinates, and within 4 minutes the Fire Direction Center, an American innovation the Germans never fully replicated, had processed calculations using slide rules, wind charts, and firing tables to put a shell exactly where requested. And when the Americans used the time-on-target technique, staggering launches from different batteries so they landed simultaneously, German bunkers sometimes received half a dozen 240mm shells within a 2-second window, more than a ton of high explosive arriving with no warning. German diaries described these strikes as instant earthquakes that made the strongest men shake. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas B. Hedkin of the 245th Field Artillery Battalion summarized it bluntly: "We don't fire barrages. We perform surgery." That surgical precision followed the Germans north into France, where the Normandy hedgerows became another proving ground for the super-heavy guns. After D-Day, progress around Saint-Lô slowed to a crawl as the German 352nd Infantry Division transformed every hedgerow into a microfortress and every crossroads into a kill zone that conventional artillery struggled to penetrate. On July 24, during Operation Cobra, the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion brought its 240mm howitzers into the fight. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones remembered watching German troops sheltering in reverse-slope bunkers, believing themselves untouchable. The forward observer called in the coordinates, 3 rounds landed, the hillside rose, cracked, and collapsed into a gaping cavity. Where the bunker had been, he recalled, was just a hole. Even the elite German 3rd Parachute Division, veterans of Cassino who had earned a reputation for never retreating, began abandoning fortified positions without a fight after a few 240mm strikes. General Richard Schimpf, their commander, was later captured and admitted in interrogation, "Your super-heavy artillery made static defense impossible. My men, who had never retreated, ran from their bunkers." This was the psychological revolution the Germans had not anticipated. Their doctrine, built on decades of fortress warfare, was collapsing under pressure they had no tools to resist. Yet the greatest demonstration of the 240mm Howitzer's mountain-breaking power came in the autumn of 1944 at the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive barrier in northern Italy. Built with a year of engineering labor and anchored in rugged Apennine ridges, its bunkers were buried in cliffs, shielded by rock, and invisible to aircraft. But the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, veterans of Anzio and Rome, dragged their howitzers into narrow valleys, positioned them with impossible precision, and began dropping rounds on German fortifications almost vertically, like meteor strikes. Private First Class Donald Matthews described watching shells rise into the sky until they vanished, then reappear only as thunderclaps that shook the entire mountain. "When we hit a bunker," he wrote, "there was nothing left but a crater." The Futter Pass, one of the strongest fortified points in the entire Gothic Line, fell in 5 days. German reports admitted that casualties from bunker collapses exceeded those from rifle and machine gun fire combined. Soldiers refused to enter shelters. Engineers begged for reinforcements. Nothing stopped the American guns. And as the Allies pushed toward the Alps and the Rhine, the German High Command began issuing desperate instructions urging troops to abandon fortifications at the first sign of American super-heavy artillery. For a military culture built on the sanctity of fortresses, this was nothing short of doctrinal surrender. The 240mm Howitzer had not only destroyed walls, it had destroyed an entire philosophy of war. And everywhere it struck, German soldiers learned the same terrible truth: the very concrete they relied on for protection had become their enemy. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the 240mm Howitzer followed the retreating German army deeper into Europe, its thunder echoing through Belgium, the Ardennes, and finally into the Siegfried Line, the fabled West Wall, a fortified barrier that German propaganda claimed was indestructible, a cement and steel spine stretching 390 miles and bristling with bunkers, pillboxes, dragon's teeth, and interlocking fields of fire. The Germans believed this was where they would halt the Allies, where concrete would do what their depleted armies no longer could. But the American super-heavy artillery had different plans. When the first 240mm round slammed into the Siegfried Line near Aachen in October 1944, the effect was immediate and devastating. Pillbox 303, a reinforced casemate designed to withstand 500-pound bombs, took a single direct hit. Witnesses described the shell as entering like a spear, boring through the west wall, detonating inside, and ejecting the roof in a cone of shattered concrete. Survivors staggered out stunned, bleeding from their ears, unable to comprehend how the fortress they had trusted had been breached not by infantry or tanks, but by a gun firing from over 10 miles away. And this was just the beginning. By the time Aachen fell, the first German city captured by the Allies, over 800 super-heavy shells had landed on the surrounding fortifications, turning casemates into craters and dragon's teeth into rubble piles. Engineers who inspected the remains reported that entire bunkers had been pushed off their foundations by blast force alone. The Germans countered with Nebelwerfers, 88s, and everything they had left, but nothing could silence the immense American guns. They fired relentlessly, targeting strongpoints, milligram nests, command posts, even individual doors where German troops might take shelter. The precision was terrifying. If a door was spotted by an observer, the door disappeared minutes later, buried under tons of shattered concrete. The psychological effects were deep. German officers wrote that men refused to stay inside pillboxes, preferring open trenches, even in rain or snow, because they could not stand the thought of being buried alive under collapsing concrete. One officer of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division wrote, "We are defending ruins with the promise of more ruins." And yet, the most dramatic display of the 240mm Howitzer was still ahead, one that would cement its place in history as the ultimate bunker killer. It came during the Battle of the Bulge, when the German counter-offensive erupted across the Ardennes in December 1944. Amid the chaos, retreat, and blistering cold, American commanders made a crucial decision: the 240mm guns must not fall back, they must stand, fire, and break the momentum of the German advance. And so, in snow-choked forests and frozen valleys, the super-heavy guns dug in once more. Near Malmedy, they targeted German concentrations assembling behind the front. A single volley collapsed entire buildings being used as barracks, killing or scattering hundreds. Near St. Vith, they shredded German supply depots hidden in the woods, detonating ammunition dumps with apocalyptic blasts visible for miles. But the most famous moment came at Elsenborn Ridge, where the 240mm howitzers contributed to one of the most lopsided artillery duels of the war. German troops attempting to break through the American line found themselves under a new form of bombardment, one that ignored trees, snow, camouflage, and terrain. Waffen-SS soldiers described the explosions as the ground lifting up and swallowing men whole. Captured Panzer Grenadiers later said, "We feared no artillery except the large American guns. They broke our spirits." After the Bulge, the road to Germany lay open, and the super-heavy guns moved east once more, heading toward the last and greatest test they would ever face, the Rhine River. The Germans believed their last hope rested in preventing the Allies from crossing the Rhine, flooding bridges, reinforcing riverbanks, and preparing strongpoints on the eastern shore. But the Americans brought their monster guns to the river's edge, and the effect was biblical. At Remagen, where U.S. forces unexpectedly captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, the 240mm guns were rushed forward to silence German batteries trying to destroy it. Their shells smashed enemy emplacements on the cliffs overlooking the river, crushing anti-aircraft nests, obliterating observation bunkers, and neutralizing guns firing on the bridge. One German captain wrote in his diary, "Every shot from the large gun tore away another piece of our hope." But the true climax came at the Remagen bridgehead itself. When the bridge finally collapsed, battered by German artillery and overstressed by endless traffic, the Americans needed pontoon bridges to maintain their foothold. While engineers worked waist-deep in freezing water, the 240mm howitzers protected the crossing with absolute, merciless precision, blasting every German battery that attempted to target the engineers. One American lieutenant said, "The 240s kept us alive. When they fired, nothing shot back." By April 1945, the Rhine was behind them, and Germany was collapsing. Yet in their final weeks of combat, the super-heavy guns still found one more mission: reducing the last isolated fortresses where pockets of German resistance refused to surrender. In the Ruhr pocket, a 240mm shell hit a concrete communications bunker so hard that prisoners later said the explosion had turned night into white daylight. And as the Allies moved toward the Bavarian Alps, rumors spread that Nazi leadership might retreat to fortified mountain redoubts to fight a last stand. Plans were drawn for the 240mm to pulverize Alpine bunkers if necessary. But Germany surrendered before the monster guns could fire again. And so, after a rampage of destruction across two continents, the weapon that began by erasing Bunker Luisa ended the war as one of the most feared artillery pieces ever used in ground combat. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the M1 240mm howitzer stood as a paradox, both a relic and a revelation, a weapon so specialized and so devastating that its very existence altered the future of warfare, yet one whose career would soon be overshadowed not by better guns, but by the dawning age of air power and atomic strategy. Still, in the months immediately after the German surrender, the US Army took stock of what this monster gun had accomplished. Engineers walked through the crushed bunkers, the split casemates, the flattened strongpoints, and the eerie craters left behind by 360-pound shells. What they found stunned even the men who had fired the weapon. Concrete walls supposed to withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs had been peeled open like tin cans, steel doors weighing hundreds of pounds had been blown off hinges and thrown dozens of feet away. In hundreds of bunker ruins across Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany, scorch marks ran along cracks where the delayed fuse shells had burned their way inward before detonating, leaving the interiors resembling shattered cathedrals filled with pulverized stone. Ordnance experts reported that in many cases the bunkers were not merely damaged but completely unrecognizable as military structures, the M1's blasts having reduced them to chaotic heaps indistinguishable from natural rock slides. And it wasn't just the destruction that fascinated the army, it was the fear. Prisoner interrogations and captured letters told a story no firing table could measure. German soldiers called the weapon the Bunkerspalter, the bunker splitter. Others called it Hollenhammer, the Hell Hammer. One paratrooper who survived a near miss at Cassino wrote that the 240mm shells made the mountain breathe fire, and another confessed that he could hear the enormous rounds descending long before they hit, like a train rushing through the sky. American planners realized that this terror effect, this destruction of morale, had been almost as valuable as the destruction of fortifications themselves. But as the army looked to the future, it faced a difficult question: what to do with a weapon that had no equal, but also no enemy left to fight? By 1946, as the world reorganized into new powers and new tensions, the US military began preparing for a different battlefield. Nuclear weapons redefined destruction. Strategic bombers could level entire cities. And the emerging Cold War suggested that the next great conflict would be decided by missiles, jets, and warheads, not by slow, methodical sieges against mountain fortresses. Yet despite this changing landscape, the 240mm Howitzer earned one final test, a conflict that proved the age of super-heavy artillery was not quite over: the Korean War. When North Korea invaded the South in June 1950, the United States rushed every available weapon to the peninsula, including some of the old giants pulled from storage. The Koreans, much like the Germans before them, had built bunkers into hillsides, ridgelines, and mountain passes, positions that tank guns and medium artillery struggled to break. So in 1951, the Americans brought in the 240mm Howitzer once again. Transporting the massive gun across Korea's primitive roads was a nightmare. Crews often had to build makeshift bridges, widen mountain turns, and use bulldozers just to move the wagons. But when the guns finally arrived at the front and fired their first rounds, the effect was instantly familiar. Entire North Korean command posts vanished under the impact. Chinese bunkers, dug deep into ridges like stone wasp nests, collapsed into blackened cavities. A single hit could destroy a cave packed with ammunition. Forward observers described the blasts as mountains exploding from within. In one notable strike during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, a Chinese strongpoint that had repelled repeated infantry assaults was hit by a 240mm shell, the position ceased to exist, and the entire ridgeline fell silent. The US Army later concluded that if more 240mm guns had been available, many costly assaults in Korea might have been avoided. But this brief resurgence was ultimately the final chapter. By the mid-1950s, the Pentagon recognized that the weapon's massive size, slow deployment, and logistical demands no longer matched the speed of modern warfare. Cameras mounted on aircraft could now guide airstrikes with unprecedented accuracy. New jet bombers could deliver far more explosive force in a single sortie. And emerging missile technology promised to render even the largest artillery pieces obsolete. In 1957, after serving across two wars and changing the very concept of battlefield fortification, the M1 240mm Howitzer was officially retired. Most were scrapped. A few went to museums. Others stood quietly in storage yards, giant steel dinosaurs haunted by the battles they had once dominated. But their legacy endured far beyond the metal of the guns themselves. Military engineers studying the ruins of German bunkers realized something startling: the 240mm had proven that there was no practical limit to artillery penetration. Reinforce concrete more? The M17 shell could be redesigned thicker. Build deeper? The Americans could add more propellant. Create multi-layer fortresses? Precision fire direction could hit each layer in sequence. The weapon had revealed a new truth: permanent fortifications were obsolete. This realization resonated through the post-war years, influencing everything from NATO defense planning to Soviet bunker designs to the US doctrine of mobile warfare. Even NATO command analysts later admitted that if the Soviets ever built deep fortifications in Europe, the United States would have needed another 240mm Howitzer, or something even larger, to crack them open. And so, the weapon that began as a bold experiment in 1940 ended as a symbol of a vanished era, a steel behemoth whose thunder once reshaped landscapes and crushed armies, yet whose ultimate legacy was to prove that no fortress, no bunker, no wall of concrete could ever again guarantee safety on the battlefield. In the decades that followed its retirement, the M1 240mm Howitzer became something almost mythic, an artifact of a violent moment in history when mankind briefly believed that concrete could stop war, only to learn that war could always find a way to destroy concrete. As Cold War arsenals swelled with missiles and nuclear warheads, and as air forces grew dominant with precision bombs capable of obliterating entire city blocks, the 240mm Howitzer, with its 8-hour setup time and lumbering transport wagons, seemed destined to fade into obscurity. Yet it refused to be forgotten. Veterans who had served the weapon spoke of it not as a machine but as a presence, a metal monster whose roar they could still feel decades later, a beast that demanded respect not only from its enemies but from the men who fed it shells and sweat. They remembered the way the earth trembled when it fired, the way its barrel recoiled like a living creature, the way entire hillsides quivered in response. They remembered the fear in the eyes of enemy prisoners when they learned the Americans had brought out the big guns. And they remembered the silence that followed after a successful strike, the eerie, almost sacred stillness that settled over a battlefield when a bunker that had been spitting machine gun fire minutes earlier was suddenly nothing but dust and smoke. Historians, too, eventually came to appreciate the weapon for more than its destructive power. It represented a moment when American engineering, logistics, mathematics, and battlefield innovation converged into one instrument, proof that the United States could not only match European weaponry but surpass it. The 240mm Howitzer was born in a world that believed Europe had perfected fortification and that America, a nation without ancient castles or fortress networks, could not possibly compete. Yet within a few years, the Americans had built a machine that rendered those fortifications irrelevant. Military academies across the world would later study the 240mm not for its size but for what it symbolized, the death of static warfare, the end of the notion that a soldier could hide behind walls and trust masonry to protect him. Even the mighty French Maginot Line, a fortress system once considered impregnable, was retrospectively judged through the lens of the 240mm. Experts concluded that had the Americans or British possessed such guns in 1940, the Maginot itself could have been cracked open like an egg. But beyond the battlefield and the academic world, the legacy of the 240mm lived on in quieter, more subtle ways. Tourism groups visiting battlefields in Italy and France would occasionally stumble across enormous craters, perfectly round bowls scooped from mountainsides or forest floors, too large to be bombs and too deep to be natural erosion. Guides would explain that these were the scars left behind by the American bunker buster. Some of these craters, untouched since 1944, became accidental monuments, vast silent reminders of where young men fought, where mountains shook, where history turned. And in museums, where the few surviving guns stand today, visitors often react with awe when they first see the size of the shells. Children tilt their heads upward, tracing the massive barrels with their eyes. Veterans stand quietly, remembering comrades lost in distant countries. And engineers marvel at how such a weapon could be built with 1940s technology, no computers, no digital modeling, just slide rules, drafting tables, and thousands of hours of human expertise. Yet for all its power, for all its fearsome reputation, the M1 240mm Howitzer also carries a strange beauty. It represents an era when war was shifting, when technology was advancing faster than tactics, and when nations were learning that the next global conflict would not be fought with slow, grinding sieges but with speed, fire, and unimaginable destructive potential. It marked the twilight of an old world and the dawn of a new one. And perhaps this is why, even today, military historians still call it the last great gun, the final, ultimate expression of classical artillery before rockets, jets, and nuclear weapons changed everything. Standing before the weapon today, restored and silent, one can almost hear the echoes of its past, the rumble of engines hauling it across muddy fields, the shouted commands of gunners preparing a shell nearly as tall as a man, the clanging of steel as the breech slammed shut, the rising tension before a fire mission, and then the unforgettable, chest-rattling, earth-shaking roar that sent 100 pounds of TNT arching across the sky. One can imagine forward observers miles away watching the horizon, waiting for a flash, then marking corrections with calm professionalism as entire fortresses disintegrated under the impact. And one can imagine the stunned silence of German soldiers who realized, too late, that their bunkers, symbols of German engineering pride, were nothing before the hammer that America had unleashed. In the end, the M1 240mm Howitzer was not just a weapon. It was a message. A steel proclamation that distance did not guarantee safety, that walls could not guarantee survival, and that even the most deeply dug stronghold could be reached, cracked, and buried. Its thunder rolled across Italy, France, Belgium, Korea, and across history itself. And though it sits silent today, it is remembered not because it fired the most shells or served the longest, but because when it spoke, the world listened. It was, and remains, the king of the bunker busters, the gun that killed concrete.